Chapter 25, The Splendor of Greece. The century and a half that followed the defeat of Persia was one of very great splendor for the Greek civilization. True that Greece was torn by a desperate struggle for ascendancy between Athens, Sparta, and other states, the Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404 BC, and that in 338 BC the Macedonians became virtually masters of Greece. Nevertheless, during this period, the thought and the creative and artistic impulse of the Greeks rose to levels that made their achievement a lamp to mankind for all the rest of history. The head and center of this mental activity was Athens. For over 30 years, 466 to 428 BC, Athens was dominated by a man of great vigor and liberty of mind, Pericles, who set himself to rebuild the city from the ashes to which the Persians had reduced it. The beautiful ruins that still glorify Athens today are chiefly the remains of this great effort. And he did not simply rebuild a material Athens. He rebuilt Athens intellectually. He gathered about him not only architects and sculptors, but poets, dramaticists, philosophers, and teachers. Herodotus came to Athens to recite his history, 438 BC. Anaxagoras came with the beginnings of a scientific description of the sun and stars. Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, one after the other, carried the Greek drama to its highest levels of beauty and nobility. The impetus Pericles gave to the intellectual life of Athens lived on after his death, and in spite of the fact that the peace of Greece was now broken by the Peloponnesian War, and a long and wasteful struggle for ascendancy was beginning, indeed, the darkening of the political horizon seems for a time to have quickened rather than discouraged men's minds. Already long before the time of Pericles, the peculiar freedom of Greek institutions had given great importance to the skill in discussion. Decision rested neither with king nor with priest, but in the assemblies of the people or of leading men. Eloquence and able argument became very desirable accomplishments, therefore, and a class of teachers arose, the sophists, who undertook to strengthen young men in these arts. But one cannot reason without matter, and knowledge followed in the wake of speech. The activities and rivalries of these sophists led very naturally to an acute examination of style, of methods of thought, and of the validity of arguments. When Pericles died, a certain Socrates was becoming prominent as an able and destructive critic of bad argument, and much of the teaching of the sophists was bad argument. A group of brilliant young men gathered about Socrates. In the end, Socrates was executed for disturbing people's minds in 399 BC. He was condemned after the dignified fashion of the Athens of those days to drink in his own house and among his own friends a poisonous draught made from hemlock. But the disturbance of people's minds went on in spite of his condemnation. His young men carried on his teaching.
In the picture, you can see part of the famous frieze of the Parthenon in Athens, a specimen of Grecian sculpture in its finest expression. Compare the advance of art with that seen in And the Animals, shown on page 105. Photo by Fred Boisonnas. In this picture, you can see the Acropolis in Athens, the marvelous group of temples and monuments built under the inspiration of Pericles. Photo by Fred Boisonnas as well. And in this picture, you can see the theater at Epidauros in Greece. Wonderfully preserved specimen showing the vast auditorium. Photo by Fred Boisonnas.
Chief among these young men was Plato, 427 to 347 BC, who presently began to teach philosophy in the grove of the academy. His teaching fell into two main divisions: an examination of the foundations and methods of human thinking, and an examination of political institutions. He was the first man to write a utopia, that is to say, the plan of a community different from and better than any existing community. This shows an altogether unprecedented boldness in the human mind, which had hitherto accepted social traditions and usages with scarcely a question. Plato said plainly to mankind, "Most of the social and political ills from which you suffer are under your control, given only the will and courage to change them. You can live in another and a wiser fashion if you choose to think it out and work it out. You are not awake to your own power." That is a high, adventurous teaching that has still to soak into the common intelligence of our race. One of his earliest works was The Republic, a dream of a communist aristocracy. His last unfinished work was The Laws, a scheme of regulation for another such utopian state.
In this photo, you can see the caryatides of the Erechtheum, the ancient sanctuary of the Acropolis at Athens. Photo by Fred Boissones. And in this picture, you can see Athene of the Parthenon. Photo by Ali Nart.
The criticism of methods of thinking and methods of government was carried on after Plato's death by Aristotle, who had been his pupil and who taught in the Lyceum. Aristotle came from the city of Stagira in Macedonia, and his father was court physician to the Macedonian king. For a time, Aristotle was tutor to Alexander, the king's son, who was destined to achieve very great things, of which we shall soon be telling. Aristotle's work upon methods of thinking carried the science of logic to a level at which it remained for 1500 years or more, until the medieval schoolmen took up the ancient questions again. He made no utopias. Before man could really control his destiny as Plato taught, Aristotle perceived that he needed far more knowledge and far more accurate knowledge than he possessed. And so Aristotle began that systematic collection of knowledge which we nowadays call science. His students at the Lyceum examined and compared the constitutions of 158 different states. Here, in the 4th century BC, we find men who are practically modern thinkers. The childlike, dreamlike methods of primitive thought had given way to a disciplined and critical attack upon the problems of life. The weird and monstrous symbolism and imagery of the gods and god monsters, and all the taboos and awes and restraints that have hitherto encumbered thinking, are here completely set aside. Free, exact, and systematic thinking has begun. The fresh and unencumbered mind of these newcomers out of the northern forests has thrust itself into the mysteries of the temple and let the daylight in.
End of chapter.
Chapter 26: The Empire of Alexander the Great. From 431 to 404 BC, the Peloponnesian War wasted Greece. Meanwhile, to the north of Greece, the kindred country of Macedonia was rising slowly to power and civilization. The Macedonians spoke a language closely akin to Greek, and on several occasions Macedonian competitors had taken part in the Olympic Games. In 359 BC, a man of very great abilities and ambition became king of this little country, Philip. Philip had previously been a hostage in Greece. He had had a thoroughly Greek education, and he was probably aware of the ideas of Herodotus, which had also been developed by the philosopher Isocrates of a possible conquest of Asia by consolidated Greece. He set himself first to extend and organize his own realm and to remodel his army. For 1,000 years now, the charging horse chariot had been the decisive factor in battles. That and the close fighting infantry. Mounted horsemen had also fought, but as a cloud of skirmishers, individually and without discipline. Philip made his infantry fight in a close packed mass, the Macedonian phalanx, and he trained his mounted gentlemen, the knights or companions, to fight in formation, and so invented cavalry. The master move in most of his battles, and in the battles of his son Alexander, was a cavalry charge. The phalanx held the enemy infantry in front, while the cavalry swept away the enemy horse on his wings and poured in on the flank and rear of his infantry. Chariots were disabled by bowmen, who shot the horses. With this new army, Philip extended his frontiers through Thessaly to Greece, and the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC fought against Athens and the allies, put all Greece at his feet. At last the dream of Herodotus was bearing fruit. A congress of all the Greek states appointed Philip captain general of the Greco-Macedonian confederacy against Persia, and in 336 BC his advanced guard crossed into Asia upon this long premeditated adventure. But he never followed it. He was assassinated, it is believed, at the instigation of his queen Olympias, Alexander's mother. She was jealous because Philip had married a second wife.
In this picture, you can see the bust of Alexander the Great, as in the British Museum.
But Philip had taken unusual pains with his son's education. He had not only secured Aristotle, the greatest philosopher in the world, as this boy's tutor, but he had shared his ideas with him and thrust military experience upon him. At Chaeronea, Alexander, who was then only 18 years old, had been in command of the cavalry, and so it was possible for this young man, who was still only 20 years old at the time of his accession, to take up his father's task at once and to proceed successfully with the Persian adventure. In 334 BC, for 2 years were needed to establish and confirm his position in Macedonia and Greece. He crossed into Asia, defeated a not very much bigger Persian army at the Battle of the Granicus, and captured a number of cities in Asia Minor. He kept along the seacoast. It was necessary for him to reduce and garrison all the coast towns as he advanced, because the Persians had control of the fleets of Tyre and Sidon, and so had command of the sea. Had he left a hostile port in his rear, the Persians might have landed. Forces to raid his communications and cut him off. At Issus, 333 BC, he met and smashed a vast conglomerate host under Darius III. Like the host of Xerxes that had crossed the Dardanelles a century and a half before, it was an incoherent accumulation of contingents, and it was encumbered with a multitude of court officials, the harem of Darius, and many camp followers. Sidon surrendered to Alexander, but Tyre resisted obstinately. Finally, that great city was stormed and plundered and destroyed. Gaza also was stormed, and towards the end of 332 BC, the conqueror entered Egypt and took over its rule from the Persians.
In this picture, you can see Alexander's victory over the Persians at Issus from the Pompeian mosaic. Alexander charges in on the left. Darius is in the chariot to the right.
At Alexandretta, And at Alexandria in Egypt, he built great cities, accessible from the land and so incapable of revolt. To these, the trade of the Phoenician cities were diverted. The Phoenicians of the western Mediterranean suddenly disappear from history, and as immediately the Jews of Alexandria and the other new trading cities created by Alexander appear. In 331 BC, Alexander marched out of Egypt upon Babylon as Thutmose and Ramesses and Necho had done before him. But he marched by the way of Tyre. At Arbela, near the ruins of Nineveh, which was already a forgotten city, he met Darius and fought the decisive battle of the war. The Persian chariot charge failed. A Macedonian cavalry charge broke up the great composite host, and the phalanx completed the victory. Darius led the retreat. He made no further attempt to resist the invader, but fled northward into the country of the Medes. Alexander marched on to Babylon, still prosperous and important, and then to Susa and Persepolis. Thereafter, a drunken festival, he burned down the palace of Darius, the king of kings.
In this picture, you can see the Apollo Belvedere.
Thence Alexander presently made a military parade of Central Asia, going to the utmost bounds of the Persian Empire. At first he turned northward. Darius was pursued, and he was overtaken at dawn, dying in his chariot, having been murdered by his own people. He was still living when the foremost Greeks reached him. Alexander came up to find him dead. Alexander skirted the Caspian Sea. He went up into the mountains of western Turkestan. He came down by Herat, which he founded, and Kabul and the Khyber Pass into India. He fought a great battle on the Indus with an Indian king, Porus, and here the Macedonian troops met elephants for the first time and defeated them. Finally, he built himself ships, sailed down the mouth of the Indus, and marched back by the coast of Baluchistan, reaching Susa again in 324 BC after an absence of 6 years. He then prepared to consolidate and organize this vast empire he had won. He sought to win over his new subjects. He assumed the robes and tiara of a Persian monarch, and this roused the jealousy of his Macedonian commanders. He had much trouble with them. He arranged a number of marriages between these Macedonian officers and Persian and Babylonian women. The marriage of the East and West. He never lived to effect the consolidation he had planned. A fever seized him after a drinking bout in Babylon, and he died in 323 BC. Immediately, this vast dominion fell to pieces. One of his generals, Seleucus, retained most of the old Persian Empire, from the Indus to Ephesus. Another, Ptolemy, seized Egypt, and Antigonus secured Macedonia. The rest of the empire remained unstable, passing under the control of a succession of local adventurers. Barbarian raids began from the north and grew in scope and intensity, until at last, as we shall tell, a new power, the power of the Roman Republic, came out of the west to subjugate one fragment after another and weld them together into a new and more enduring empire.
End of chapter.